Hi everyone, welcome. Yeah, that's me waving at you. That's my faint reflection in the screen of my computer. Let's get this screensaver off, because what I came here to my computer to show you is my tracking spreadsheet. And as we do sometimes, I like to come in here and take a quick look at how things are progressing in all my different active worm bins to figure out what the best thing is for me to spend my time on today. And it was kind of a toss-up. I did look at one possible option, which was to visit in on my what are primarily my red wiggler bins, which at this point have been going for 9 days since they were last fed. But there was something else that I've kind of had on my to-do list for a little while now, which I thought would be an opportune thing to spend a little time on today, and that was to visit in on my what is now a 52-day-old worm bin. And that bin over here, you'll see, is got a population of what I estimate to be 2,200 worms in it, which I know is almost for certain a number that's way shy of the actual population of that bin. In fact, I think some people have actually commented in my videos every time I've made reference to that number, suggesting that the population in that bin is probably twice that. So my idea here was to visit in on that bin. And even though it's already been 9 days since that bin was fed, I would imagine that down that area where the feeding was placed, we're probably going to find ourselves a good number of worms hanging out there. And it should make it pretty easy for us to go in there and grab ourselves some volunteer worms with which we can populate a new bin. And as you can see down here, the last line of my tracking sheet here includes a bin which was built 6 days ago now. And for anyone interested in seeing how that was done, I could place a link to the video I made of that in the upper right hand corner, showing how that bin was built. Just a simple example of me building a bin, talking a little bit about the different options that are available to someone who's building a new bin. And now that the bin has had a few days to sort of sit and prime, I think it's time that we can go ahead and introduce the worm population to that bin. There are some other examples of it, actually just one example of it visible here. Usually I'll just make that line vanish away, or that column vanish away, once there's no pertinent information that I'm tracking on that column anymore. But in this case, I am tracking the last feeding of one of my red wiggler bins, which has been a month now since it was last fed. So once I get around to doing something in that bin, this column will vanish as well. But for now, we can still see that in this column, we can see the time that this prior bin sat from the time it was built until the time it was populated. It was 9 days. And in that case, that bin had a little bit more time to sort of get pre-populated with microbes and bacteria and fungi. So I'll usually build a bin and then just let it sit and let it age a little bit, and prime is how I refer to it as. And in this particular case, it will have been 6 days from the time that the bin was built up until the time is getting populated, which is today. And I think that's usually a really good idea, because if you don't do that, what you're really doing is you're introducing your worms into a sterile environment, which isn't really the best. It could result in the worms not feeling comfortable there, trying to flee, and it's always best that the materials in the bin have a little bit of a chance to start breaking down in advance of the worms coming in, so that the worms can almost immediately start taking advantage of the materials in the bin. So that's the reason I usually put a little buffer time into there from the time that the bin is built until the time that I populate it, for that particular advantage. So we're going to head on down to my wormery now, visit in on my 52-day-old bin, pull out some recruits, and use them to launch off my new bin. So let's head down there now and get working on it. So down here on the floor is the bin that we're going to be pulling worms out of today. It's actually my second youngest bin. And up here on the bench is where we're going to be placing the worms, which is the freshly built bin that was made 6 days ago. So I'll move things aside here, make a little bit of room so we can get the other bin out here onto the bench, and we can get started. Alright, so now here in this donor bin, the bin that we're going to be recruiting our worms from, we've got like our typical coverings of plastic and cardboard and paper and everything like that. Things have been pretty run-of-the-mill in this container. Some of my other bins have had their plastic coverings removed because I was sensing maybe a little bit of excess moisture. But when I see the plastic coverings, that's usually an indicator to me that things were pretty much normal in the bin. So I've got a couple worms that have done what I've been seeing happen a couple times. They've actually made their way inside of the plastic bag. And I don't know why, but I'm going to have to probably get these little wormies out of the bag. Hopefully they're all still alive and well. But I've been thinking that it might be time to turn that into just a sheet of plastic, kind of open it up to not be a bag anymore. And then it'll still serve the purpose of not allowing excess moisture to evaporate, but it'll no longer become a place where the worms can slither into. It's so weird because I use bags all the time. It's just the first place that I've observed worms making their way into the bag. Just makes me wonder if maybe that bag had some sort of really tasty produce in it that's drawing the attention of the worms wanting to go in there. Maybe they sense some delicious food item that was stored in that bag at some point. It's the only thing I could think of. These paper coverings, whether it's this what remains of this coffee filter, which was indicating to me where the last feeding occurred, or this piece of newspaper, which is usually kind of a catch right under the plastic where the moisture evaporates onto, that I like to have, where the worms hang out and sort of greet me when I first arrive in the bin. Both of these pieces of paper have been really tattered to shreds at this point. And I'll position them back in the bin when we're finished doing what we came in here to do, but I've got a feeling that the next time I feed this bin, which could be very soon, I was even thinking about maybe just coming right back down in here after we take care of this and maybe feeding my red wiggler bins, because it's been 9 days since I last fed my red wigglers, and that includes this bin right here. So I'm sure they'll be due for a feeding. This will actually be a good opportunity to see how the food is holding up in the feeding zone, which is where we're going to expect to find the worms that we're going to be trying to extract out of here today. And if it looks to me like the food has been pretty heavily depleted, then maybe I will actually come back in here and visit in on this bin, as well as my other red wiggler bins that were also fed 9 days ago last time, and just go ahead and feed them. I've certainly got a fair bit of food scraps accumulating in my freezer, so making a little space in the freezer would also be a welcome thing. So I don't know, either later today, maybe just tomorrow, we'll see. I might have a feeding following this soon. So I've got myself a plastic tray here that we could place our recruit worms into. And a lot of times when I'm actually migrating worms, I'll go to the extra effort of making sure that I've separated the worms pretty thoroughly from the material that they inhabit. But in cases like this, where I'm just doing an extraction of worms out of an active bin, I don't go so crazy trying to keep the worms separate from the compost and the material that they're inhabiting. So I don't know if I'm going to be able to get a good accurate reading on their weight. There's a peach pit. So maybe we'll just use the visual estimation method of trying to guess how many worms we've got in here when we move them. And that might be adequate. So you could see the feeding that we placed in here last time does appear to be drawing a crowd. So we're already seeing a good number of worms just from skimming off the top inch or two of material here. Some of the things we've encountered already, I believe this is a piece of bread. I wasn't really going to crush it up. This is just some bedding that was part of the feeding area. You know, this peach pit, clearly also part of the feeding, but more of a kind of experimental food item. Here's another very tough, hard substance, which is the seed of a avocado. But sometimes after a little while, the avocado seeds become pretty easy to break. So you can see right away, We've managed to snap this one in half. In time, it does become soft and breakable, which you would never imagine could possibly occur when you check out an avocado seed when it's still fresh. So it does feel to me like if we just go ahead and we start scooping out of here, we'll probably find ourselves a good number of worms pretty quickly. Now I see why we've got so many worms hanging out there. That's just a piece of cantaloupe, which last time we were in here 10 days ago didn't seem like it was a very popular item, but it seems like its popularity has significantly increased. So I think it's time to start scooping some worms out of here. What do you think? What is this? Just a piece of paper maybe, or could that be? No, I thought that might be the rind of another piece of cantaloupe. I'm pretty sure there were multiple pieces of cantaloupe in here. We might encounter another one as we start scooping. So let's go ahead and take a handful of worms, position them here in this little plastic tub for transport. If I can remove large chunks of stuff that's not worms, I will. Like this piece of paper, pretty thick piece of paper. I'm not sure what it may have been. Maybe a piece of newspaper. I don't see any writing on it though. Maybe a coffee filter, although coffee filters are usually a little bit thinner. Yeah, we're definitely getting a pretty good number of worms collected here, and I don't even know if we're going to need many more. I was kind of hoping for what we see here, which is a good congregation of worms on one or two key pieces of food, so that we could bring over mainly worms and maybe not so many food items, maybe not so much finished compost. I'm wondering if this is enough. I think this is actually enough. It's got some pretty good weight to it. I would think it's got to be somewhere in that 1 pound area, almost. Maybe close to 1,000 worms. And I think just for the ease of record keeping, I'll just estimate it to be in that neighborhood of about 1,000 worms. This is definitely the rind of a cantaloupe. Pretty much stripped clean of all the melon, all the fruity portions of melon from it. But yeah, you can see we found a little chunk of what appears to be bread. Here's a little seed, a peach pit, unless it was a piece of peach, or maybe plum, actually. I thought I had pulled all the plum seeds out. This would be, hard to say, banana peel? Can't believe I'm actually able to recognize some of these items. This is clearly the piece of plantain that we placed in here, I believe, last time. These are clearly cantaloupe rind and a banana peel stem. And this was just paper, I believe, just some paper bedding. But if you really look at it collectively as a little pile of leftovers, maybe this is another piece of banana or plantain, it's not a lot. So this bin definitely seems like it's due for its next feeding. And I'm sure down here we'll also find, if we went looking for it, other scraps of food. But that's not what we really came in here to do. If we come back in here, you know, another day or two from now, or maybe even later today, to feed this bin, then we can probe around further. But I believe our mission at hand is complete, to get ourselves some volunteer worms, scoop them out of here. Maybe we could leave some of this casting material behind, some of this uneaten bedding material behind, and try to reduce this down to just worms only if possible. I don't want to return a whole bunch of worms in the process, but I did see a couple opportunities to pull out a larger chunk or two of food and a couple little handfuls of accumulated vermicompost, which results from the worms trying to burrow down and get out of these bright lights. And I guess we've probably pulled out enough material here to start considering what I have here in my hands. Almost a pure collection of worms only. Here again, it's another banana stem. I'm just finding a couple larger chunks of bedding material, food material that can easily be pulled out without pulling out too many worms along with it. So, is this 1,000 worms? If not, it's got to be pretty close to it. And we're bringing over with it a little bit of casting material, a little bit of food items too. But I think this is what we were after right here. We're going to use this right here to launch off our new worm bin. So let's sort of reconstruct what we found here. I'm not going to go crazy, but I figured if I can take some of this bedding type material that we encountered along the way and spread it out down where the feeding area was, and then on top of that scatter in all these food scraps that we pulled out, we can almost reconstruct the feeding area again, so that if we come back in here at some point in the near future, we can sort of expect to find perhaps a slightly more concentrated congregation of worms right there in that spot. I do feel like I'm approaching the capacity limit of this bin, because it does feel pretty full. And usually that's the trigger for me, you know, if a bin seems like it's kind of reaching the limit of its capacity, sometimes that'll be the reason that I decide to, you know, stop feeding a bin and start steering it towards migration and harvest. So at this point I'm just restoring all the stuff we found on top. That little piece of paper that was attempting to indicate where we had last fed was just scraps. It's all been blended in at this point. That was not really something I could pull out and set aside for reuse. And this piece of paper is almost at that stage too. It's terribly tattered and almost not a single sheet of paper anymore. It's just scraps, especially down the middle. You can really see it now. So I think that the next time this bin does receive a feeding, all of this paper will probably just get scattered down within the feeding zone underneath the freshly added food. And it'll take on a new purpose of being bedding at this point rather than sort of a top cover. And I always like seeing how this top covering piece of paper gets chewed up by the worms from being the landing pad of all the recirculating moisture within the bin. And I guess the other to-do item that I would want to at some point take care of is first of all getting the worms out of the inside of this bag. And my only hope is that I don't have any dead ones starting to accumulate in there. If I think that were the case, then I might be able to smell that. So I'm not so worried. I just want to make sure that the exit is clear so that they can hopefully find their way out at some point. And I think if a worm starts to get a little bit desperate in terms of maybe being hungry or feeling things are not damp enough, it'll get on the move and it'll start looking for something better. So my hope is that if any worm does start approaching that point where it could be in jeopardy, then it'll just, on its own, find its way out of the plastic bag. So I'm going to remain a little bit optimistic and hope that the worms are not going to get themselves into a pickle by remaining in that bag right there. And we're going to just proceed to releasing the worms in their new bin. So let's get on with that. Alrighty. So now right here is the new bin that we're going to be positioning these little guys into. And it's a similar setup as we saw in the other one, where we've got plastic coverings. In this particular case, we just don't have a piece of cardboard covering the plastic. But a lot of times I will include some sort of an opaque material, like a piece of cardboard on top of the plastic, so that right underneath the plastic it is nice and dark and cozy, so the worms feel comfortable going there. Because then right beneath that is the piece of paper where the recirculating moisture that's in the bin that was unable to evaporate into the air collects and drops onto. So this is usually where I'm expecting to find a good number of worms hanging out, right here on top of this top cover paper. And this top cover paper is in good shape because there's no worms in here yet. But if the worms start, you know, hanging out on the top of this to collect some of that moisture that you saw on top, then I'm sure that the the paper will start getting consumed pretty quickly by the worms in pursuit of that lovely moisture. So you can see here the worms have been making their way down into the material, trying to get out of the bright lights overhead. And we're going to give them a chance to actually get out of the bright lights at this point by simply inverting the container, letting them all drop right down into the new environment. And then they can get themselves situated in their new home. So, without further ado, let's introduce these little guys to their new bin. Here we go. Looks like we've only left a couple behind. Let's make sure we don't forget anybody. Some of them are pretty tiny, little baby worms. And I think we got them all. Oh, one more, very tiny one. Very little itsy bitsy baby worms stuck on the plastic. But I think we've gotten all of them out. So I think I'll usually try to, you know, spread them out just a little bit so we don't have any worms that are sort of on the top on a pile of other worms and unable to retreat down into the sanctuary of the bin below. But by spreading them out a little bit this way, I think we give them all equal access to the bin below, and they can all get out of the bright light. So let's give them a minute or two to get situated, and then we'll be done. All right, well, I pretty much see no worms on the top surface. Here and there, I think I see a little piece of a worm here or there, but I think for the most part, they've all retreated down into the bedding of their new home. So I think it's time to close things up here and let them have their peace again. So I'm glad they all pretty quickly made their way down into their new home. They all seem like they've gotten situated pretty quickly. So I think we're going to proceed with the restoration of all the coverings. We'll get this newspaper back on top. We'll get this fairly damp piece of plastic on top, and at some point I might actually put a piece of cardboard on here too, just so that the worms feel nice and comfortable hanging out right below this fairly translucent piece of plastic. Maybe I should even open this thing up to not be a bag anymore so that the worms don't end up crawling inside of this one too. It's just something I'm going to have to take care of at some point, I believe. So at this point, the last thing that we'll normally do, and if you're a regular on the channel, you'll know what it is that I'm going to do here, which is to inaugurate the bin with a new label. Because all my bins have labels on them, and even though I've got a pretty good tracking spreadsheet to let me know where things stand with all of my bins, I also like to make sure I have some sort of a simple record right there on the bin showing when the bin was originally built and launched and all that stuff. Well, maybe not built, but at least launched and populated with worms. So that's it. Please join me in welcoming the newest worm bin in my wormery. And it'll probably be the last new worm bin of the year. Next time we launch any new bins, it'll probably be in the new year. So let's go ahead and get these guys situated, find a place for them on the shelf, and then I've got a little bit of other things to put away, a little bit of cleaning up here to do. Not much though, luckily. But I won't keep you around for all that boring cleaning up and and putting things away, because who wants to bother with that? Oh, uh-oh. I just spotted 2 more little baby worms here, and they are tiny. Did I miss anyone else? I might have to take another close look at this before I go to the sink to rinse this off. Oh, but I'm glad I spotted these little guys before we clean up. Every little bit helps, right? It would be a shame to see a couple baby worms flush down the sink unnecessarily. Alright everyone, that's it for today. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, please remember to give me a thumbs up. That's always really appreciated. If you haven't done so already, also consider subscribing to the channel too. That's really appreciated as well. Have a great day. Bye now.